Well, I'd like to welcome you to session 2 of 4 that we call Prophecy 101, or What is the World Coming to? In this session, we're going to explore proofs from past history. Now, our agenda, the first session, last time, you may recall, we had a basic introduction. What is the nature of time? And how sure can we be that the Bible prophecy is really prophecy? In this session, we're going to explore some other examples of prophecies that have been fulfilled. Some of them may be quite familiar to you, some of them may be quite a surprise. And then this will be followed next time by a review of what's called the end time scenario. What does the Bible talk about as climaxing God's plan for mankind? And then the fourth session will be, what do we do between here? What can we expect from where we are today and the end times? Are we moving into the end times? If so, how can you tell? What would be going on? But today we're going to just explore proofs from past history. Now we're going to indulge in some graphics, and when we use Old Testament references, I'm going to use a sort of a scroll format to make you conscious of the fact we're drawing from the Old Testament. When we do from the New Testament, I'm going to use sort of a parchment motif in the graphics, because we'll be popping back and forth. But to help you realize what's Old Testament, what's New Testament, we thought that might be helpful. But one of the fundamental questions that we touched on last time that we want to talk a little further about is what makes Jesus Christ unique? There are many, many highly venerated religious people throughout history. And what makes Jesus Christ unique? Well, probably the most profound issue is that every detail of his life was written down in advance, before the fact. His entire life was a fulfillment of prophecy. In fact, we discover that in the Bible, these 66 books penned by 40 different guys over thousands of years, we discover that every detail in the Bible is there by deliberate design and relates to Jesus Christ. That's my challenge to you as you study the Word. In fact, the Scripture does say the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Now, as we look at, one of the things we'll need to do as we get into this is to have a basic perspective of history. And the Bible really embraces what generally is regarded as about 6,000 years of human history, starting from the creation, the fall of man, and of course the key fact throughout the entire panorama is of course the person of Jesus Christ and the cross. Now, this whole cosmic drama that we're engaged in, of course, started with the rebellion and the fall of man. And all of us know the story in Genesis. But we should realize that in Genesis 3:15 we have a declaration of war by God himself against this rebellion. And it speaks of two seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And in Genesis 3:15, very key passage, God says, I will put enmity between thee, speaking to the serpent, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. And it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. A very often quoted verse because it introduces this strange phrase, the seed of the woman. That's a contradiction in grammar, let alone biology. The seed is in the man. Already in the grammar here in Genesis 3, we have the hint of the virgin birth. But what many people overlook is there's another seed alluded to in the same verse, and that's the seed of the serpent. And that's a phrase that will be personified in a world leader yet on the horizon, distant horizon. And we're going to talk quite a bit about him, especially next time. But this starts a chain of promises, prophecies. The seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15 identifies that God is going to redeem the entire creation, not just you and I, but the entire creation, through the human race. When we get to Genesis 22, he calls Abraham, out of whom he's going to make many nations, but one specific one, namely Israel. And that's confirmed to Jacob, and finally David, the family, and so forth. We could build a whole chain of these prophecies. In the interest of time, we won't try to do that here, but be sensitive that everything that we're going to talk about links to those chain of promises. When we get to the house of David, we get to Isaiah makes a very, very interesting pronouncement. God says through Isaiah, says, therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, the, not a virgin, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. This is a verb. Now, some people quibble with the Hebrew there. When that was translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ was born, the Greek being very precise and very unambiguous, clearly it's talking about a virgin. The virgin birth, hinted at in Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden, reconfirmed by the prophet Isaiah. Now, as we look at the biblical panorama of history, after the, obviously we have the fall of man, you get to Genesis 6, you have the flood, and after that the call of Abraham, and finally the Exodus. When you get to the Exodus, you realize that almost half of human history is covered by one book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And then after that, of course, after the Exodus, we have birthed the nation Israel, and obviously finally get to the house of David, and ultimately the nation goes into exile. And all that's covered in the rest of the Old Testament. So far in this history, what we've talked about on this timeline is from the creation through the exile. And that's the Old Testament. Now we're going to focus a little bit on the monarchy after David before the nation goes into exile to pick up some interesting insights. Now, Samuel closed the era of the judges and ushers in the monarchy. First king was Saul, then David, then Solomon. And then after Solomon dies, there's a civil war, and the nation splits into two. The northern kingdom, called the house of Israel, the southern kingdom, called the house of Judah. And the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, covers that history. And Chronicles is a recount of that history, especially from the point of view of the southern kingdom. But as we look at the northern kingdom, that's also the era of Elijah and Elisha, these incredible prophets, trying to counsel them to stop worshiping false gods. They refuse. The northern kingdom goes from bad to worse, and ultimately, as Hosea and others prophesy, gets wiped out by their enemies, the Assyrians, the Assyrian conquest. The southern kingdom doesn't do much better. There's occasionally a good king, but in general, the southern kingdom also goes from bad to worse. And it ultimately will go into the Babylonian exile, a very key milestone in Israel's history. But we're going to focus a little bit on one of the incidents as these kings go from bad to worse. We finally get to a king by the name of Jeconiah. And we get to, in Jeremiah 22, verse 30, God, by the time we get to Jeconiah, is so upset, he pronounces a blood curse on the line of Jeconiah. In Jeremiah 22:30, God says, "Thus saith the Lord, write ye this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days. For no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah." Now, on the one hand, we look at that and recognize that God's pretty upset. But as we realize what God's saying here, if we've done our homework, we should be startled. Because this has been preceded by all kinds of promises that the Messiah would come from the line of Abraham, from Jacob, from the tribe of Judah, and from the house of David. You can follow all those promises. When you get to this blood curse, the way I always imagine it in my own mind, I always visualize it when God declared this blood curse on Jeconiah, I always visualize celebration going on in the councils of Satan. The whole Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, can be viewed as an attempt by Satan to thwart the plan of God. You can actually go through all the specific events, all the conflicts, the flood of Noah, all these events, as really responses to Satan trying to thwart the plan of God. Well, when you get to this blood curse on Jeconiah, I always visualize Satan celebrating, because certainly he must have felt that he now had got over a barrel, because God has committed himself to produce a Messiah from the royal line of David. But now there is a blood curse pronounced on the royal line, on his descendants and following. No man of his seed shall prosper. Is the Messiah going to be of his seed? Well, as I imagine Satan celebrating this apparent paradox that God has got himself into, I always visualize the Father turning to the angels saying, watch this one, okay?